I can't believe these things are gone. These fires are tremendous. These hotels that were the lifeblood of Sullivan County, parts of Ulster County, parts of Orange County, for decades. From this silver era of the Catskills near the turn of the century, right through the golden era of the Catskills after the I'm a person who's been fortunate enough to live and breathe this classic Catskills. I was one of those city kids who came up every summer. My father worked at small places, schlocky places as we used to call them, the Shady Nook Country Club in Loch Chodrake, nicer places like the Flagler Hotel. We stayed at bungalow colonies like Breezy Corners, and eventually he worked at the Stevensville Country Club in Swan Lake, a year-round resort. But every summer, we used to come up, we made the trip. The Red Apple Rest was the one and only stop, and then we came up to the Catskills. You know, the whole family was in the car, mom, dad, smoking in the front, windows open, sort of like a Turkish bath with all the smoke coming in. That was our trip to the Catskills. We knew when we hit the Palisades, we saw the green, we knew we were near the mountains. When we hit the Red Apple Rest, we really knew we were there. Thank God for the Red Apple Rest and all those bathrooms that were open 24 hours a day. And then we hit the Catskill Mountains. And for a city kid, I was very lucky. Place where my father started. My family moved up, and he worked at the Stevensville. So I went from being someone who went up in the summertime to someone who was here year-round. And I became very lucky because about 12 years ago, my family, who has been living in Sullivan County, I got to work here at the Times Herald Record and cover these Catskill Mountains and write about it and be able to, in a certain way, try to tell this story. It's an amazing area. You try to explain to people that this area has a population of
I'm going to restart. Apparently there were some issues with the sound, so I'm going to restart it for you all. I apologize. Sounds like there might have been some sound issues.
I can't believe these things are gone. These fires are tremendous. These hotels that were the lifeblood of Sullivan County, parts of Ulster County, parts of Orange County, for decades. From this silver era of the Catskills near the turn of the century, right through the golden era of the Catskills after the mid-40s, up until in the middle of the 80s, is gone. I'm a person who's been fortunate enough to live and breathe this classic Catskills. I was one of those city kids who came up every summer. My father worked at small places, schlocky places as we used to call them, the Shady Nook Country Club in Loch Chodrake, nicer places like the Flagler Hotel. We stayed at bungalow colonies like Breezy Corners, and eventually he worked at the Stevensville Country Club in Swan Lake, a year-round resort. But every summer, we used to come up, we made the trip. The Red Apple Rest was the one and only stop, and then we came up to the Catskills. You know, the whole family was in the car, mom, dad, smoking in the front, windows open, sort of like a Turkish bath with all the smoke coming in. That was our trip to the Catskills. We knew when we hit the Palisades, We saw the green. We knew we were near the mountains. When we hit the Red Apple Rest, we really knew we were there. Thank God for the Red Apple Rest and all those bathrooms that were open 24 hours a day. And then we hit the Catskill Mountains. And for a city kid, I was very lucky. That's what my summers were like. And my first introduction to the Catskills, probably from the time I was an infant. My father was a tumbler, an MC. He was one of the guys who cut his teeth in the entertainment business, like so many others. When I was 17 years old, I was working as a busboy and later a waiter at the Shady Nook, place where my father started. My family moved up, and he worked at the Stevensville. So I went from being someone who went up in the summertime to someone who was here year-round. And I became very lucky because about 12 years ago, my family, who has been living in Sullivan County, I got to work here at the Times-Star Record and cover these Catskill Mountains and write about it and be able to, in a certain way, try to tell this story. It's an amazing area. You try to explain to people that this area has a population of about 75,000 year-round, but in the summer, it triples. And for a period of time, there used to be 900 resorts, and then there were bungalow colonies. And in the olden days, we had things that we called hookah lanes, that were basically these kitchens that everybody ate at. And all these hotel stories are pretty much the same. We had people from Eastern Europe came over here. They wanted a better life, so they left the tenements of the city. They come up to the Catskills. They want to be farmers. And they find out that, like so many other people, this is not exactly what you call great farmland. But if you have cows, you're okay. And you can do corn, and you can do apples, and other stuff like that. And so they would have these small boarding houses in which they would use the food from the land, the eggs, the milk, other products, and they would serve their guests. And the guests loved it. And why wouldn't they? Fresh air, close to the city, but just far enough away, the water. It's everything that makes the Catskill special. And these boarding houses, these people who ran them, they realized, we've got something here. And so the boarding houses began to grow. And those who were able to turned 20-room boarding houses into like Grossingers, 1,200-room resorts. We're able to tell you these stories, and we're going to do it through their voices. You're going to see the hotels. You're going to see what they were like in their heyday. You're going to see what they look like today. It's classic Catskills, and if we don't do something now, it's going to be gone.
Okay, so Jeff, why don't you go ahead and give us...
Actually, I'm going to start and say hello to everyone. It's so great to see you all. I miss all of you. Today, we are so honored to have Catskill royalty. Barry Lewis is our go-to person for everything Catskills. Between his amazing videos, articles, and a great book, we've been able to relive time that no longer exists. I can't thank him enough for taking us back to this place that we all remember so warmly. Hundreds of you have taken our Catskills workshop, but for those of you who haven't, this was a time and place that was so special and hard to describe if you didn't live through it. But it's an important piece of American history. My mom, Molly, is actually watching today. She's 99 years old, and at a bungalow colony beauty contest in the early 1950s, she won the title of Mrs. Sullivan County. At a swimming pool bathing suit beauty contest, similar to that in Mrs. Maisel. Years later, at the Pine Grove Hotel in Cohonson, she suggested that her waiter, Jeff, would be a nice guy for me to meet. Well, I guess she was right, because this summer we're celebrating our 53rd wedding anniversary. I know you will all love going back in time today, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, who's going to tell you more about our very special guest, Barry Lewis. Jeff?
Thanks, Di. It's so great to see everyone again. We know that this is a unique piece of time that many of us experienced. And those that didn't, we're hoping they joined us today too, because it's something that everyone can appreciate. You know, we all came, most of us came from other countries. Our parents, our grandparents, ancestors all came to America at some point in time. There was a great many, many decades when these immigrants were not welcome at resorts. And even though many of them went, as Bruce always kids, everybody seems to come from Brooklyn at some point in time, even if you didn't, if you came from the Lower East Side or other parts of New York City, you probably didn't live the lifestyle that we live on Long Island today. So I think it's really important that we appreciate when Barry starts talking what the evolution of the Catskills has been about. It became a safe place for Irish, Italians, and Jews to go and live a resort life that maybe they remembered from Europe. And as the opening piece by Barry explained, there were hundreds and hundreds, and sometimes it doesn't matter who you read. It's not an exact science, but maybe there were 1,000 resorts and bungalow colonies and coca lanes. But more importantly, one size didn't fit everyone. There were very expensive resorts that many people went to. You'll hear about the Grossingers and the Concords and that type of place. But there were also schlocky ones. Now, Barry alluded to that before, but Barry, I stand to disagree with one thing. The Shady Brook, to me, was a classy resort. I know schlocky. I had relatives that owned them. I worked at them. I struggled to make my tuition from them. But you know what? They all fit into the mosaic which made up the Catskills. And I think we need to appreciate this part of America because it was so important. Now, why we're so happy to have Barry is we've been using him as a resource probably 5, 6, 7 years ago when we called him at the old job at the newspaper and tried to pick his brain. And if we were starting a workshop at OLLI, what would we use for resources? And for those that aren't aware of this, it's very limited. Unfortunately, people didn't make a lot of things on film. They didn't record enough on paper. All right, you know, Tanya Grossinger did, Alan Lesser did from Lesser Lodge. A few people did. Phil Brown, John Conway, to name a few, but that's about it. There's a handful of them. So what we did is we relied on Barry's resources and his history, which you've seen, his bio, which has been sent to you many times, really speaks to the type of person he became as an adult. Because when his father, who was a tumbler and very important in the entertainment industry, both in the city and eventually at Great Neck's Leonard's, and eventually, more importantly, up in the Catskills each summer from the time Barry was, I think, only 3 until they moved up there permanently in '77, and he became the head entertainer at the Stevensville Hotel. He really gained a love and appreciation for the lifestyle and the importance of the Catskill Mountains. So even though he graduated with a degree in communications, I'm sure he could have gone in many directions with his reporting skills. However, he stayed true to the region. His book, From Brooklyn to Bubalik, probably means that I'm assuming that he found a much greener pasture than Brooklyn, and he stayed the course as his children over the years. So it's with great pride and pleasure that I present to you Barry, who is a unique person because he started this at such an early age and has stayed the course. And the only thing I feel bad about, for those of you that have taken some of the music courses at OLLI, I think it must have been late 50s, the Ponytails had a song, Born Too Late. To me, I think to Diane and I, Barry, you might have been born too late to save the Catskills, but you sure as hell gave it a shot. So we appreciate what you've done and we thank you and welcome you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Jeff and Diane, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Just shake your heads if you can. Very good, Simon says. All right. And thank you very much for inviting me to talk about something that I do love to talk about, which is the Catskills, the Borscht Belt, that golden age between 1940 and 1965. When, as I've said, and depending on who you ask, there might have been more than 500 hotels and 1,000
bungalow colonies. And it's hard to imagine that as you drive through. If anybody has driven through the Catskills in the last 20 years, you drive through the roads, and what you may see now is the brick pillar of where lights would have been. Or if you look closely in the woods, you could see the cement pool. And other than that, that's the only remnants, unless a place is being used by for some other means, be a religious means or social means. Other than that, these places are gone. And I knew early on that it was important for the next generation to keep alive and for them to realize and understand what had been taking place and how, like Miami Beach and some other places, the Catskill Mountains was one of the premier vacation spots in the United States for, nearly 50 years. And that's an extraordinary thing. And as quickly as it rose is, unfortunately, just about as quickly as the demise came, which is just as sad and frustrating. Just a little background, because people ask, well, how did the Catskills get started? Why did they get started? Well, for the most part, and for many reasons, people came up to the Catskills. They came up today, as they did 20 years ago, as they did 50 years ago, for more than a century, because of clean air, to get out of the city, to enjoy the environment. Originally, the Catskills began as a way in the late 1800s. It had to do with the tuberculosis outbreak. And so doctors were telling people to go up to the Adirondacks. There was a Dr. Loomis who had a practice in the city, and the Adirondacks at that time was a little bit difficult to get to. Unless you were the Vanderbilts and you had your own train, you couldn't get up easily to the Adirondacks. And so the Catskills were only 100 miles from New York City. And so people went up there, and Dr. Loomis, through some financing, was able to, J.P. Morgan, some others, was able to build a sanitarium right outside of the village of Liberty in the town of Liberty. And the sanitarium was a place where people there was climatological treatment, and it was about the climate. And that really is the silver age of the Catskills. People being treated for tuberculosis. The area which had gone through tanneries are now being populated because of some areas as a resort spot, hotels, boarding houses, restaurants, all tied to the tuberculosis community as well. Well, that works until in the early, say, 1940s, late 1930s, people do not want to come up to an area that's known as being the place for people being treated for tuberculosis. There's a stigma attached to that. And so slowly, the funding for the Loomis Sanitarium dries up. It closes in 1942. And just around that period of time, maybe about 5 years, 10 years earlier, for the most part, Jewish immigrants who were desperate to get out of the Lower East Side started buying up property. Now, some did it earlier, but it was the same idea. Immigrants coming up, a lot of them started with farms. And if anybody has ever lived in Sullivan County, you realize you could do many things with the land, but growing a lot of things with it is hard. It's very rocky. And so people found that farming was difficult, and they had horses and they had cows. And so to supplement the income, because the farming was so bad, they took in boarders. And that really is the genesis. Taking in boarders, and those who were able to do well with the boarders expanded. Now, Jeff and Diane, both your parents, honeymooned at the Stevensville. And
Right.
we'll talk about the Stevensville and Swan Lake, which is where, as I said, I in many ways grew up. Well, if they had swam in the lake, they probably might not have been the only ones who were going to be swimming with the fishes at that time. For those may not realize, and I'll give you some background on some of the stuff that went on in the Catskills. In July of 1937, a body popped up in Swan Lake, and tied to that body was a 31-pound rock and a slot machine. And that body was thrown in the water by a bunch of gangsters. the Catskills was also known as a place called Murders Incorporated. And the gangster vacationed, as did everybody else. They vacationed in the Catskills. The old President Hotel in Swan Lake for being one of the places. And so Walter Sage's body popped up, and the Catskills had a lot of different, it's known for a lot of things, but it was also known as a haven for the gangsters to get away. A couple of things about the Catskills. People wonder what was the first year-round resort, and that was the Flagler Hotel that was in Fallsburg. That is the one that had that mission style, and most of the hotels, if you look back in the 30s and the 40s, most of those hotels really did all look the same. The early ones had the wraparound porch, which eventually became closed in, and most of those hotels built out. So you would see the main building. You saw that with Kutcher's, you saw that with the Stevensville, you saw that with the Browns. They couldn't tear it down because they couldn't afford to not have a season. So they just built out. I can't imagine the number of building zone violations that would have taken place during that period of time, and how much money was passed under the table so that they were able to build. Unfortunately, because they built that way, many of the hotels that did have fires became tinderboxes. But they would build out, they would build up, but you saw the main building, that structure stayed. Another rumor, Jerry Lewis did not begin at the Browns Hotel, but he began at the old Ambassador Hotel. That was located also in Fallsburg. It was run by a guy named Charles Brown. Charles and Lillian Brown then started another hotel called Brown's Hotel, and Jerry Lewis, who was a busboy at the Ambassador, and really kind of got his start working on stage, doing some skits and stuff. That's where he began. And when Charles and Lily had a hotel at Brown's, Jerry would then go over and, as a thank you to who he called his Aunt Lillian, perform over there. And because of the close relationship with the Browns, that's how they got to be known as Jerry Lewis's favorite place. It was the Brown Derby nightclub. And so that was the relationship, but it didn't start at Brown's. And of course, the longest running hotel in the Catskills at the time, or before it closed, was Kutcher's Country Club, which lasted over a century. Began in 1907, closed in 2013. You saw the pictures of me walking with Helen Kutcher. Helen had the strongest handshake of any person I ever met. And Helen Kutcher, like so many of the hotel owners, they knew their job was to be the ambassador for their hotel. And you would go up to Helen, and after a second meeting, she had a book, and she knew, and she would study it and memorize it before guests would come in. So she knew the names of the guests, their children's names, where they stayed, previous rooms, what they liked. And so when she would come introduce herself back at the lobby, she had a total understanding of who you were as a guest. And she came in every day wearing pearls, looking very sharp, and there were no off days. This was their life. This was their, they didn't go on vacations. These hotel owners, this was their home. They didn't live necessarily at the hotel. Usually a lot of them had properties on the hotel grounds or very close to it. They had a home, but for the most part, those were the hotels. Now I'm gonna take offense to what Jeff said. We were talking about couples. Jeff and Diane met at the Pine Grove. I met my wife Bonnie at the Shady Nook. I was working there as a busboy, and we've been comparing notes about schlocky hotels. Here's where the Shady Nook comes in as schlock. When I worked Passover at the Shady Nook, we had to clean up our station. The big pieces of matzah that fell on the floor went back into the box. That's schlock.
I lose.
The Shady Nook was just and it was more typical. I love the fact that the Shady Nook was not a hotel, but it was a country club, which is interesting. My guess is that because it had an outdoor pool, the women would exercise their arms moving around mahjong tiles all day. And of course, everyone raced into the dining room for food. So that was the exercise. So that is why it became a country club. Working there, and looking back now, I find it's really hard, but we actually had an over and under when you work Passover, because most of the people, the average age of someone, a guest at the Shady Nook was Methuselah. That was about the given age. And so we have an over and under as to how many people would actually survive the entire Passover vacation. Because as we had nothing, but it was the juices in the morning were either prune juice or orange juice, and the dessert was either applesauce or stewed prunes. And so you're figuring that combination of prune juice and stewed prunes with nothing but multi-boxes of matzah. Usually you lost at least 2 people. You wanted to get tipped early because everybody lost at least 2 people on your station by the end of that year. But the Shady Nook had about 200 rooms. And again, it was a small place. But that was one end. Liz, picture number 2. If the Shady Nook was the small end, well, on the big end, so that's the Shady Nook. Beautiful pool. And again, this was a place that nice outdoor pool, had a baseball court somewhere. At that point, it's not year round, so nothing's connected, which you would have been if it was a hotel that lasted through into the 80s and the 90s. But you had the Shady Nook at one extreme. Picture number 2, Liz. On the other extreme, the Concord. Again, in 1935, by Russian immigrant Arthur Winarek, takes possession of the Ideal Plaza to settle a debt. If you didn't know, Winarek is the person who invented, that blue stuff when you're at the barbershop, that Jervis hair tonic? Well, he invented that. That's where he got his money. And basically, the Concord stays in the Winarek Parker family for 61 years. He designed it. He knew what Grossingers looked like, and he wanted a special place. And he was looking at the Fontainebleau and the hotels of Miami Beach, and he wanted a Concord. He wanted a resort that resembled that. Something different than any other hotel in the Catskills at the time. Had the white marble sweeping staircase. Eventually, the Concord has 1,200 rooms. It's on 1,700 acres. They've got 2 18-hole golf courses. The story is he wanted to know how many holes Grossingers had, and when they said 18, he said, build me 50. So he had the famed Monster, the International. He had a $2 million indoor pool. They had the Imperial Room, which at that point was the largest nightclub. It had 2,300 seats. It was the biggest resort in the Catskills, but it was not the most famous. Liz, picture number 3. The most famous was Grossingers. Began in 1914 as a farm. Selig and his wife, Malka, they're immigrants from Austria. If you wanted to stay at Grossingers in its first years, it was $9 for 1 week. They had children, Harry and Jenny. And Harry and Jenny were smart enough, they hired PR master Milton Blackstone. And it was Milton who really helped create the mystique of Grossingers. One of the earliest things he did was he had heard that there was a boxer named Barney Ross. He was a lightweight champ who was looking for a place to train. And he finds out that Barney Ross is an Orthodox Jew. Well, Milton says, look, I've got a place up in the Catskills. It's kosher food, a lot of land. You can train. He brings him up. But more importantly, coming with Barney are all the New York City press. And so suddenly now you've got a built-in PR stream of people who are staying at Grossingers. They're being fed by Jen. They're staying in the country. Damon Runyon writes that it's the Lindy with trees. That's how he describes Grossingers. And he turns, of course, Jenny Grossinger into the first lady of hospitality. You've got Grossinger rye bread. You've got the Jewish cookbook. Jenny Grossinger is on This Is Your Life. They also bring in Morris Lapidus. He is this great architect, and he is the person who designed that indoor pool. He also designed the grand staircase at the Concord Hotel. Comparing the Concord and Grossingers would be like comparing Macy's and Gimbel's. You know, they're number one, number two, and there's a big distance from who's number three. The Concord was majestic. The Concord was tremendous. But while the Concord is this marble, Grossingers, and picture number 4, Liz, Grossingers was Hamish. Grossingers was 35 buildings, 1,200 acres. Grossingers has the big G. Grossingers has the Olympic-sized swimming pool, which was cut by Esther Williams, did the ribbon cutting for the indoor pool. They have an outdoor skating rink in which Sonia Henning cuts the ribbon on that. They've got a ski hill. They have their own post office. They have a weekly newspaper called the Grossinger Tattler. The idea of the post office was also Milton Blackstone's idea. So when people were sending postcards and communicating with Grossingers, it wasn't Liberty, New York. It wasn't Ferndale, New York. It was Grossinger, New York. Anything to keep the Grossinger name going. And of course, Grossinger had its own airport. Here's a picture of Eddie Cantor with Ida and Jenny Grossinger. And the amazing thing about Milton is he also created stories. One of the more famous stories, of course, was that Eddie Cantor discovered Eddie Fisher at Grossingers. Well, that might not necessarily have been true. Eddie Fisher had already been working at Grossingers, doing some stuff, but it sounded good. And anything that sounded good and that the press ate up became good. The amazing thing about Grossingers that I love is that you never knew for sure who was going to be there. Picture number 5, Liz. Walking in the dining room, you're in the dining room at Grossingers. Suddenly you turn your head and Eleanor Roosevelt is walking through the dining room. This is, there is no bodyguards. You're not eating in a separate location. She's going to be in the dining room with you. Picture number 6. You may be sitting and you turn your head, and if you're a sports fan, you notice, gee, isn't that Jackie Robinson? Jackie Robinson, Grossingers became a haven for him. In the early 1950s, Rachel Robinson, in her book in which she credits Elaine and Jenny Grossinger for helping them financially because there weren't too many places. Ball players, as we know in those days, were not making the $1 million contracts, and they really couldn't afford vacations. And if you're the Robinsons, you're also limited as to where you can vacation. Well, that didn't matter to the Grossingers. And they were welcome there. I don't know. Elaine never said if they stayed there for free, but I imagine that they worked out a pretty good deal. But it became a place where no one bothered them, no one minded. And Rachel Robinson really in her book appreciates and notes has the gratitude and how generous the Grossinger family was to them. You could be on a dance floor at Grossingers. Picture number 7. And suddenly you turn your head and who do you see? Jane Mansfield and husband Mickey Haggerty. This was in 1961. He, of course, is the former Miss Universe. She, of course, is a pinup girl, a movie star. In case you didn't know, he and she are the parents of Mariska Haggerty from Law and Order. That's their daughter. What I love about this picture, and this again is typical of many places Grossingers, look to the couple to your right. I would compare this to me as like the before and after. The couple to your right are the before. And then suddenly if you exercise and, a little makeup, you could be the couple on your left. He's got the pinstripe jacket. He's got the nerdy glasses. And if you look at this, the young lady he's with, if she was to stand next to Jane Mansfield, I have a feeling she would probably come up to Jane Mansfield's very handsome bosom. And she would be right about her chest. Liz, picture number 8. Here's another person with a chest-high view. Now, this is Joel Gray. It's not his bar mitzvah picture, but it's probably close. And he's dancing with Elaine Grossinger at his. You talk about eye level with someone's chest. The irony, of course, here, and Joel Gray spent many years performing at Grossingers. And again, irony, Joel Gray's daughter, Jennifer Gray, was the star of Dirty Dancing. And Dirty Dancing, as we all know, was not filmed in the Catskills. It was filmed in North Carolina, but it was supposed to be. Instead of Grossingers, you have Kellerman's. And one of my favorite scenes in the movie Dirty Dancing is that they're going to perform at the Sheldrake. And you wouldn't come up with the name Sheldrake unless you knew. And of course, the writer of Dirty Dancings was Eleanor Bergstrom, who did Vacation at Grossingers. And it was that vacation. And her nickname was Baby, and her father was a doctor. And so that's where that all came. And so she took elements of it. Anybody who's ever worked in the Catskills, and I know for sure that Jeff can agree with me on this, is the reason why Dirty Dancing was not real is because those staff quarters could not have been anywhere, they weren't anywhere near as nice as they make them out as at Dirty Dancing. I stayed at staff quarters at the Shady Nook, and I happened to bunk in my bathroom with, I was a city boy. And, growing up in Brooklyn, and suddenly you're thrown in. My parents threw me at the Shady Nook. I'm in Loch Sheldrake. It's April and there's snow on the ground. And I'm thinking, there's places with snow on the ground in April. What kind of a place are you sending me to? And we're in the staff quarters, and we go into the bathroom, and there are bugs in there the size of Buicks. And we have visitors. And little short story. All of you probably have read about this in your history books, the famous Passover strike of 1977. I'm working at the Shady Nook, and it's April, and the Shady Nook did not have any heat in the staff quarters, because the staff quarters were separate little cottages away from the main building. The main building has heat. So it's April, you're in Sullivan County, nighttime it's 15 degrees, daytime it's maybe 29 degrees, no heat. We're sleeping in our jackets and parkas, and we tell Jack Barron, who was the owner of the Shady Nook, that unless you give us heat, we're going to leave, and you're going to have to figure out how to feed 400 hungry Jews for Passover. And the first night he didn't believe us, and I wound up sleeping in the lobby of the Shady Nook because I couldn't sleep in my room. And I'm waking up, and it's about 6 o'clock, and I see Mr. Goldblatt, one of my guests, and he comes over to me and just kind of focusing in, and I see Mr. Goldblatt, and he looks at me and he says, "Barry," and he's got a very concerned look on his face, and I can see that he cares about me, his waiter, sleeping on a couch. He looks at me and he shakes me. He goes, "Barry," and I go, "Yes." He goes, "You think you can get me some Sanka?" That's the Shady Nook. So again, famous people at Grossingers all the time, but without question, maybe the most famous Grossinger moment, picture number 9, Liz.
Let's see picture number 9.
The wedding. 26-year-old Eddie Fisher marries 23-year-old Debbie Reynolds at Grossingers in 1955. Most of you, of course, know that the two of them have a daughter named Kerry. She goes on to have a pretty good film career, plays this little role called Princess Leia. You might have heard of it. Now, Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds have a lot of Hollywood friends, but their best friends are Elizabeth Taylor and Mike Todd. Very good friends. In fact, when Elizabeth Taylor and Mike Todd get married, Eddie Fisher is the best man. Debbie Reynolds is the matron of honor. They're such good friends that when Debbie and Eddie have a second child, they name it Mike for Mike Todd. These are very close people. Well, unfortunately, a year after Elizabeth Taylor and Michael Todd's wedding, Todd is killed in a plane crash. And Eddie Fisher rushes to Elizabeth Taylor's side to comfort her. Well, he comforts her very well. Comforts her so well that a month later, he separates from Debbie Reynolds. And picture number 10, he marries Liz. They marry in 59, and he brings Elizabeth up to Grossingers, of course. And Liz, of course, goes to Grossingers. My guess is she's having a little whitefish, maybe some flanken and a sanka, who knows? Now, again, it's the picture. This, arguably, they are the most famous couple in the world. It's Liz and Eddie. And they're at Grossingers. And I try to imagine the minds of these waitresses who are serving them. Yeah. They're not in a separate dining room. They're not eating in their hotel room. They're eating in, you could see the seltzer and I think some pickles on the table. I believe that's Milton Blackstone, making sure that Eddie doesn't say anything really stupid like, hey, Liz, why don't we have some kids or something like that, or I'm about to leave you too. The waitresses in the background, I like that they're local folks, I'm sure. And what were they thinking, looking down at this? And Liz, dressed down for the part. She's only wearing the most gorgeous pearls, anyone, and the necklace. But again, this is what takes place at Grossingers. Picture number 11. Grossingers, like many other places in the Catskills, particularly in the summertime, this is where the politicians went. If you're going to woo voters from New York City, well, you're going to come up to the Catskills in the summer because all the press is going to follow you as well. And so it doesn't matter if you happen to be a name figure or not, like Robert F. Kennedy, you're going to come to Grossingers as well. And you're going to go because you're going to see, you never show who you're going to see. Picture number 12, the Concord. Let's go back to it. You look at that structure, it's tremendous, right? It's got multiple pools, multiple tennis courts, multiple golf courses. It's got the gas station right on the property there. 50,000 tulips line the road leading up to the main building. Well, the demise of the Catskills was swift. By the late 70s, most of the hotels had closed. By the early 80s, they're all teetering. People ask, why did the Catskills end the way they did? And there's not one factor, but there's multiple factors. The advent of air conditioning being built is always listed as one of the top ones. People no longer needed to get out of the city. It was cheaper to go with flights. People can travel to Europe. People could fly to Israel. People didn't need to just travel to the Catskills. Also, I think it was a generational thing. People came to the Catskills because of the assimilation. Their neighborhoods were the Catskills, just in the country. It was the same food. It was the same music. Friends went there. Relatives went there. So the people you knew at home, a lot of your neighbors in the Catskills were the ones who you were close to. You had the Jewish Catskills. You had the Italian Catskills. You had the Irish Catskills, which were a little bit further north. But again, it was all about assimilation. People were comfortable where they were. I think one of the most, there's other two parts, is the cost. By the 60s and the 70s, you look at this property and suddenly now the taxes are being hit. The other part is, one of the videos that we have, we talked to Mark Kutcher, and Mark Kutcher talks about that people at first were very happy to swim in a lake. Then they wanted to swim in a pool. And then suddenly they needed an indoor pool. And other hotels had to build indoor pools. And people played tennis outdoors. And suddenly all the hotels had to build indoor tennis courts. And I said, well, what was the breaking point? And he said, when we started to build indoor squash, that became, an indoor racquetball courts, that became the severe breaking point. and a lot of the hotels just couldn't afford it. The other part is when you build rooms and buildings that don't bring in money, that don't bring in revenue, you're losing money. So now you have to build more hotel rooms to offset that cost. And if you're building more hotel rooms, then you're building a bigger dining room. And again, all that adds up. In 1997, the Concord Hotel files for bankruptcy. It owes Sullivan County more than $8 million in taxes. And in 1998, it closes. In 99, the Concord is sold at a bankruptcy foreclosure for $10.5 million to a partner, Joe Murphy, and he's got a silent partner, Louis Capelli. And I can assure you, Louis Capelli would not stay long as a silent partner. He was a silent partner like George Steinbrenner was a silent partner for the Yankees. And eventually they buy up the Concord and Grossingers. They get Grossingers for $6 million, and they get the Concord for $10 million. Later, Capelli buys out Murphy. This is the Concord before. Picture 13. It's the Concord now. Became a brownfield site. People think, and you read, that the casino is on the grounds of, was built where the Concord is. Well, it's on the property of the Concord. But as you can see, the lake is in front. If anybody remembers, if you were driving around Kayamisha Lake, and you could see, and it was always a beautiful sight. You looked up and you saw those white towers. Well, the picture you're looking at now was where those towers were, where the buildings were. That's not where the casino is. The casino is near near the golf courses. It was by the Monster and the International, which they then combined. So it's on the footprint of, or the property of the Concord, but not on the actual footprint of where the hotel was. Picture 14, Grossingers. Amazing, right? After more than 70 years, in 1986, Grossingers is sold to Servco. They bring back Eddie Fisher to push down the dynamite plunger on the old Playhouse. I covered the event. Here is a little souvenir that they gave the press, and it is a picture of the old, it's a little memento, and it's a piece of the old Playhouse. And they brought Fisher back. Also in 1988, Brown's Hotel was sold for $5.3 million. I was trying to look for a picture of what Grossingers looks like today, and I went over there Sunday. Picture 15, this is Grossingers today. That's Grossingers. There's nothing there. Everything has been taken down. After years of deterioration and graffiti, finally, it's been cleared. There's talk about development. I would imagine with the following the COVID-19 and the economy, I would guess that this is going to be on hold for quite a while. But this is Grossingers today. But I don't want to end on a really kind of downer note. So picture 16, Liz. In 2000, I was working at the Times Herald Record. I was a Sullivan County editor, and I was just starting up my column. And I thought it would be fun to go back and write a column about what it was like to be a waiter, a busboy in the Catskills. Now, there weren't too many hotels in 2000, but the Raleigh Hotel was still open. That is Manny Halpert, who is always dressed to a T. If you look at it, there he is, smart. Manny was like so many hotel owners. You'd be walking through there at 5:30, 6 o'clock, and you'd see them. They'd be walking the halls, in the dining room, in the kitchen, making sure everything was okay. Now, the staff knew that I was a reporter doing a story, but doesn't matter. And Manny knew that too, but it didn't matter. So I go in and I pulled out my old bow tie. That's my black bow tie from when I worked at the Shady Nook in the Stevensville 20 years before that. And I figured, okay, I'm going to be a waiter, busboy. And I start putting the cold soup on the tray. Now I learned from my years of working in the hotels that you put a piece of cloth on the tray so that the soups would not slide. So Manny sees me And in typical fashion, he looks at me and he says, ask me what I'm doing. I said, I put a cloth down. And you could see him tugging on the cloth, and he says, these things cost 15 cents each to wash. Next time, use paper.
Mhm.
That is the Catskill Mountains. That's how the resorts in many ways were able to stay
What he showed.
in business for as long as they were able to. And I have a feeling to some degree that's probably part of the demise. That's my talk on the Catskills. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we have some questions in the chat here. Let's see. Can you speak a little about what the region looks like now?
I always said that Sullivan County has a very small, and I'll talk about Sullivan County for the most part, that is the Catskills, it's Southern Catskills. Parts of Warsing, Ellenville, you know, had the Nevele and the Falls View. Some parts of Orange County, Southern Orange County, Northern Orange County, but predominantly Sullivan County is a small county. It only has 75,000 year-round residents. But in the summertime, for 2.5, 3 months, the county population would triple for everybody, all of us who came to the Catskills. Well, that holds true still today. Sullivan County's population triples, but it's no longer us folks coming up, but a good large portion is an Orthodox group. Satmars and religious groups coming up to the Catskills, again, for the same reason that we all did, getting out of the city in the summer. So the region has a lot of Orthodox, has a lot of second home folks. And as you might have read in the Times, that's going to be growing. It grew after September 11th, and that continues to grow as people want to get out of the city. Year round, they opened up, you have the casino that opened, you have the water park, colleges. I mean, it's not, winters are not as tough, I think, because the climate's changed. But the region is, you drive through, and a lot of the old hotels, unfortunately, and a lot of the bungalow colonies are still seasonal. And so you will drive through hamlets. But the big difference was in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and all the 80s, when the hotels were year round, all those hamlets and villages, Monticello, Liberty, South Fallsburg, all the main streets were open, and you had restaurants, shops that were open year round. You know, Katz's and Singers and Kaplan's and the beauty salons and all those places. And of course, before malls, you had Sullivan's and, you know, all the shops. Well, when all those year-round hotels closed, a lot of those places closed. So suddenly now the hotels closed, the bungalow colonies closed. I always say Sullivan County was a factory town, but the factory were the resorts. And once you lose those many jobs and those people go, those main streets all closed. And so now a good portion of those main streets are either completely closed year-round, like portions of Liberty or Monticello, or parts of Fallsburg, South Fallsburg, Woodburn, Woodridge, that are almost taken up entirely by Orthodox or religious, you know, various sects of the Jewish religion, and they are boarded up until generally middle of June, when the yeshivas start closing, until just before Labor Day. You know, good food, a lot of traffic, people who decide that we're not going to use turning signals, people who are going to walk in the middle of the road because you do that in Brooklyn. It's a fun place to drive in the summer. But the sad part is when, and I'm sure a lot of the locals don't mind because traffic does change, but it's a mixed bag. That's what the Sullivan County is today.
Okay, I have another question from Mike D. My mother had a cousin who owned a small hotel near Warsing. It was originally the Jefferson, and then they went into Chapter 11 and reopened as the Glenbriar. My sister worked there for several summers. Are you familiar with that place?
No. I try to know a little bit about everything, but again, we're talking about 50, but no, I don't. But that was probably typical of most of the small little resorts.
Barry,
No, I don't.
Liz, I just want to ask Mary one thing for
Mhm.
people that don't know the region. The summer I met Diane in '65, which was the end of the golden era. We didn't know that, but that was the demise, really starting to set in. And the hotels were getting much slower. I worked everywhere from Cahonkson to Parksville to Fallsburg to where the Homowac was in Ellenville or Spring Glen and at Gilbert's. I mean, I worked all over to survive because each hotel was getting slower and slower as you went into the month of August. I don't know if our members can appreciate, especially the ones that didn't go up to the Catskills, how the region looked. I know you had that map, which we didn't use during your presentation. Is there any way we can just project to show in other words, this was not the Strip in Vegas and it was not the boardwalk in Atlantic City. It sounds like a tightly knit area and it wasn't huge, but it was spread out. You needed a car and you needed to be able to get around.
It was, yeah, you had, for the most part, and I'm generalizing because as I moved up to the Catskills, I began to realize that places in Western Sullivan County that, in Callicoon or Jeffersonville, town of Delaware, Fremont, that may or may not be familiar to most of the folks on here, they also had little resorts. And then you had Livingston Manor in Roscoe, town of Rockland. They had little ones. Predominantly, certainly the town of Liberty, which includes the village of Liberty, Swan Lake, Ferndale. They had town of Thompson, which has Monticello, Sackett Lake. They had the Laurels Hotel. They had some big, beautiful ones. And of course, Fallsburg, the town of Fallsburg, which has hamlets. There's not a lot of villages or cities. There's no cities in Sullivan County. And so most of the places are hamlets, and they would have small ones. But in the summertime, yeah, you would go, everything's like 20 minutes. But in the summertime, I would go to the hotels. I worked in a magazine, Panorama. And the smaller hotels would have the shows starting at 9 o'clock, 9:30. And so the entertainers would go there. And then the big hotels would have the show starting at 10:30, quarter to 11. And so somebody could perform, particularly midweek, because the hotels had shows, you had the big hotels like the Stevensville and others would have shows every night. The other ones might have bingo one night, movie night, and shows on a couple of other nights. But you would have someone who would perform 9 o'clock, 9:30 at, let's say, the Del Mar or a Shady Nook or someplace like that. And then they would go to do a 10:30 show at Brown's, Stevensville, Kutcher's, Fallsview, Tamarack, Homowac, name your Browns, Raleigh, the Hayden, at those places. And then the other hotels had the late show. And so you would then have shows that were starting and they were kind of blue. And some of them had a stripper. Some of them just had a comic. And they would then perform a late show somewhere. So if you went to, let's say, the old Triangle Diner in Liberty, which there's an argument at which place had the best roast pork and garlic bread. You either had the Triangle Diner in Liberty, or my favorite was Poppins. And of course, as we all know, roast pork on garlic bread is considered to be kosher food. That, like bacon, it's the 12th commandment. That was a label to have. As long as you had good duck sauce on the garlic bread, on the with the roast pork and garlic bread, you're okay. And it can't be it had to be the dipping one where you can put a big smear on it. So you would go to, let's say, the Triangle Diner in Liberty, and you'd see truckers, and you'd see college kids, and you'd see entertainers wearing tuxedos. They were going to get a food from one place to another. And it was so exciting. And those were the people who, of course, didn't go to the coffee shop, because the coffee shops were I could do another hour on just the coffee shops of the Catskills. It's almost like its own little subset, because that's where you really, that was the, you went for, because you've gone now almost 2.5 hours without any food in your system. And so you needed to then go up to the coffee shop to replenish, because you were going to be going another hour without food. But we all know that was okay, because when you got to your room, you had stowed away the danishes that you had stolen from the dining room, and those have been put into napkins, and those are in your underwear drawer. So if you get up at 3 in the morning, you've got this yearning for a Danish, or maybe a little, they make, the strudel. They made it to Stevensville, the apple strudel. You had some strudel you can have. And you had that at like 3 o'clock in the morning, which would then give you a little break because you were right up ready to eat breakfast at, 7:30. That was really when the golfers were supposed to have breakfast, but you lied so you can get into the dining room early.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions in here. So I'm going to go through them. Can you speak about Kutcher's reputation during those years?
What was that?
Can you speak about Kutcher's reputation during those years?
Sure. Kutcher, every hotel was known for, the Browns was known as having a very rich adult clientele. Places like, the Concord, obviously, and Grossingers were places that I would never have been able to afford. Those were high-end places. Kutcher's was really nice. Kutcher's was more of a sporty one. They would host the famous Maury Stokes basketball game that I got to cover. They built the Clairby Field House. Will Chamberlain was a bellhop there. Kutcher's was just a great resort. Milton and Helen Kutcher ran it, and then Mark. It was one of the places where the next generation did. But again, nice, had the lake, had the golf course, beautiful hotel. It wasn't as large as the others, but very, very well kept. It was a beautiful resort.
And how long was the Homowack Lodge in business?
It's still standing. For a while in the early 2000s, they were actually using it as it had been bought up by Orthodox Jews, but they didn't have a lot of the permits, because I remember we did stories and they didn't have the permits, and there were some problems. There was a fire hazard, and they made all the kids, they were trying to figure out how to get them out of there. I don't have the exact date for them for closing, but I would imagine probably in the mid-1980s. Because I do know that by the early 2000s, it was being used as a kind of a Jewish camp. Most of those places were Jewish camps, and those were yeshiva, a combination of the two.
Carol Goldstein just made a comment. She was in the area last summer and stayed in a refurbished hotel, which she thinks was the Fagler. And then I have
Probably, unless she's Orthodox, I'm guessing not. She might have stayed at the Villa Roma, which is really the Villa Roma is the only Catskill hotel from, let's say, and that's changed over the years, from the 70s and the 80s. That's still up. They had a bad fire. You talk about just having bad luck. The Villa Roma for years was, was tough making inroads. And so one year at the Villa Roma, they decided to rent out the place for Passover. And there was going to be a large contingent, obviously, of Jewish families coming up for Passover. And they had to get the kitchen ready, and they were burning up food and stuff. And there was a tremendous fire at the Villa Roma, and they burnt the kitchen and half of the dining room and rooms, and they rebuilt. But that really is the only, and that place is not kosher. A beautiful hotel, not easy to get to by any stretch. If anyone's ever gone to the Villa Roma, beautiful golf course. Paul Carlucci and Marty Passante run it. But that's really the only one. The Flagler, no. The main building of the Flagler is gone, but it's a Jewish, it's an Orthodox. I don't know if it's a Satmar, but it's an Orthodox place.
I was in my camp in La Sheldrake. My girls go to Stage Shore in La
Stage Shore Manor, right?
Stage Shore Manor, and I needed a place to stay with my husband. So we went around, and we got to a hotel that was decent. It was just was like opening. I think it was being bought up by Asian people. I'm not sure, but it was a big hotel, and if it wasn't a Flagler, it was another. It was one of the big ones that they were reopening.
When was this?
Last summer.
Oh.
That's the one.
There was
They did yoga
I don't know.
retreats there.
there was an Asian doctor who had bought the Stevensville, but
Was it-
they went out, so I don't believe that the Stevensville wasn't open last year. And at the site again, it's not. They tore down Kutcher's. There is no Kutcher's anymore. But
wasn't pictures.
on the area near Kutcher's is they built up Veritas. It's a health, but that's Indian. So I don't know where you might have stayed. Maybe there was a nice Asian couple that let you in and stayed at
No,
their
it was
house.
beautiful. It was nice. It had a huge lobby. Really, seriously, couple stories high.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Or either that, or maybe you were just trespassing and you were staying in some empty place. I
That
don't
would
know.
have been cute.
I'm not sure. Stage Door Manor is open. They didn't open this year because of COVID-19.
Right.
But Stage Door Manor
Yeah.
used to be the old Carmel Hotel, and that's where Stage Door Manor is, where Robert Downey Jr. Went to school. Did acting, and I forget the actor John Cryer from 2.5 Men, and
Mm-hmm.
beautiful actress. She won Academy Award. I'm drawing a blank on her name, but several people have been to Stage Door Manor. But yeah, that's the old Carmel Hotel on
Okay.
Carmel Road.
Bruce Jonas asked, were these hotels awaiting gambling, and would the arrival of extensive casinos have saved them?
They all were waiting. That was what was keeping them going. And for between 2000, if you remember, there were a bunch. The idea was there's no gambling was not allowed in New York State. And so you had various Indian tribes that were looking to work with the resorts, and New York State was trying to, as a way of generating revenue and helping upstate New York, there was going to be Indian-run gaming, kind of like Connecticut. And so they were trying to work out some land trust deals so that Pataki was working on a deal where they would give an Indian tribe, if you were a valid Indian tribe, land, and in exchange, you could not make any more claims against New York State or the federal government. And so you had the Stockbridge Muncies, and you had the St. Regis Mohawks that have a very, very small casino, bingo hall in Aquasani near the New York State border. And so you had these legitimate tribes that were working with, there was supposed to be a casino at Kutcher's, very close. They actually signed papers. TV stations covered it. It was a really big deal. There was going to be one at the Raleigh. There's all these stories, Capelli bought. Everyone was buying with the idea that casinos were going to come. And through various things, you couldn't get the federal government because you needed the federal government approval if there was going to be tribal land. You just couldn't say, okay, you're a tribe, but you can have the land. But then you were dealing with the Secretary of the Interior, and if it was a Democrat or a Republican. So there were various hurdles. In the end, as we know, none of those things came to pass. It's hard to say. It probably wouldn't have hurt. If you would have had casino gaming in the 1970s, I think it would have been a different situation. But by the time we even see now with Resorts World Catskill, that time had passed.
Okay, looking at the region on Google Earth, it seems that the Concord and Kutcher's golf courses are still there. True? This is from Robert Lang.
The Concord golf course is, again, that's where they're still working on. The golf course was supposed to be open when they were building the casino. The golf course was going to be open in the very first season. Well, that didn't happen, and there was many other issues. And the golf course was not going to be open this year. Now, of course, the casino was closed. So they're still going to be working. And for people who play golf, you know that if you're not working and upkeeping on a golf course, you're taking 2-3 steps back. So I would not expect there to be a golf course. And they were combining the International and the Monster. So I wouldn't think you would have a golf course at the casino before 2022. Liberty had the golf course. Kutch's had one, but it hadn't, it was used last year. I don't know where it is now. So Google Map, you might see it, but it's not in operation. No, the other golf courses are the ones that are county or town run, like the ones in Fallsburg and other places.
Tina asks, do you remember Morris Katz?
Yes, the artist who can draw a painting in 5 minutes. Yeah, Morris used to, I would see Morris in the lobby of either Kutch's, or I remember Morris at the Stevensville, and he would paint up, and you would have a Morris Katz picture.
And I unmuted Len Ferrano. He had a story he wanted to mention. Len?
Okay.
Yeah. So my
Hey,
wife,
Len.
my wife and I lived in Rockland County, in Muncie. Tolman actually was the town, but right in Muncie. And my father had passed away about 3 months before, and we were kind of like, and we were getting flooded with my wife's family, who just kept coming up on the weekends, to comfort us. Meanwhile, we had a swimming pool, so I knew why they were there. So we finally decided to go. Two Jewish couples who we were very close with said, "Why don't we go for a weekend at Grossingers?" And my wife said, "That's a great idea. We'll just get away from my family." So we packed up and we went to Grossingers, and we're checking in, and all of a sudden I hear this noise, and I look around, and here's this short guy, leading this 50 people, okay? And it was my wife's uncle, who was a venerable in the Sons of Italy in the Bronx, who decided that same weekend that that's where they were gonna be. So all of a sudden, we were surrounded by the same people we were trying to get away from. I thought that was hilarious, the fact that they went to Grossingers for that weekend. I'll never forget that.
That's a good story.
Yeah, most of the hotels, particularly, they all went from couples to then having special weekends. In the end, most of it was the conventions that were keeping the hotels alive. In the wintertime, I remember at the Stevensville working there, and there would be the ski conventions, which were great. The ski groups would come up, and they would get box lunches. So you didn't even have lunch for them. Most of them were on the slopes at Holiday Mountain. They would bus them over there. So they were there for breakfast. They left early, came back. But it was, and the hotels were still kosher. I mean, Stevensville, Grossingers, even if you had guests who were not kosher, that didn't matter, because they still weren't going to get, you weren't going to get non-kosher food.
Absolutely.
Here's another question. Do you remember the Melbourne Hotel?
No, where was that?
It doesn't say. Joel Ryder. I unmuted you. Joel, if you want to elaborate.
No, where was the Melbourne?
It just says, do you remember the Melbourne Hotel? Joel?
Yeah, hi. It was on Briggs Highway near the Echo in Ellenville.
Okay. No, I'm not familiar. I'm familiar with Briggs Highway.
Yeah.
That area has had a lot. I am now working, and I give a nice plug, because during my working hour, I'm doing this. I left the Times Herald Record newspaper for many reasons, including which newspapers are in less control. So I am very happily vice president of communications for the Construction Contractors Association, which is based in Newburgh.
Right.
And so I live in Sullivan County in the town of Neversink, and to get to work, I take 52,
Yeah.
and I look over. That's where they still have the gliders and everything. And I
Sure.
would look over, and you could still see, because the Nevele is still up, and it has, of course, that iconic round building.
Sure.
It's weird when you drive around, and for the longest time, even when Grossingers was closed, if you were driving on Route 17 westbound and you were getting past Swan Lake was exit 101, Ferndale, and then 100 was Liberty.
Right.
And the strength of Grossinger family is, again, think of this. So they're building Route 17, right? The quick way. They're going to number this thing.
Yep.
Grossingers gets exit 100. Coincidence? I don't think so.
Right.
But you would look in the distance, and you saw the Jenny G, the tall tower, the biggest building. Many of the fire companies had to get ladder trucks because between Grossingers and the Concord, suddenly you needed ladder trucks because they were the tallest buildings in Sullivan County. Right now, the tallest building in Sullivan County is the casino. But you would see the building in this distance. And when you came around Kiamisha Lake, you would see the Concord. And when they were taken down and you didn't see it, it changed what the Catskills were. They had been changed long ago, but for someone driving around like myself,
Yeah.
that was one of those last nails in the coffin.
Let me share this picture, if I may. This is a photo of my father and I about 1963 at the Grossingers on the toboggan run. Can you make that out? It's just a kind of
Very nice.
yeah.
Yeah, Grossingers had the toboggan. They had, my brother learned to ski at Grossingers. They had the tow ropes at Grossingers. You would hold on and get pulled
That's right.
up. But Grossingers, in fact, you can still, where I live, you go around the reservoirs and you could take the back road into Liberty. And so you go past Airport Road, where they had the airport, and you go kind of around the golf courses, and you can get to where the ski hill was. So it's long ago, but it's not long ago.
Right.
It's very interesting as looking at these resorts. You think about it. I mean, I'm working at the Shady Nook, and it's 1977, 78, and so many larger resorts were already closed and gone by then. So you've got the Shady Nook open in 80, and by 85, Grossingers is closed, Concord is done, Kutcher's a couple years later, and then that's it.
Thank you. That was great. Appreciate it.
I think you might have answered this, Barry. There's someone that asked, is it mostly bungalow colonies in the summer now?
No, there are, there's probably a handful of bungalow colonies that are non-religious, that are actual bungalow colonies. I think I know of one on Route 42 heading towards Monticello out of Fallsburg. But for the most part, almost all hotels or bungalows are taken up by Orthodox Jews. And so the pools are covered. There are mikvahs that are built. It's a different dynamic. One of the nice things is you can still get great rugelach in the summertime from Levy Gumbos and some of the food that I grew up with. But it's very different. But no, there's really no. If you haven't been up there in a while, you'd be surprised.
Barry, could you give us a little bit of an overview of what your website is about? Because I know
Sure.
we're running late, and
Yeah.
in fairness, you are working today. But the thing that I think many members would love to probably share with their families and their kids and their grandkids who didn't experience the Catskill phenomena of that era is basically recorded by you on your great website.
It's classiccatskills.com, classiccatskills.com, and it's
You want to see this?
pictures. It's the videos that I did with John Conway. He's the Sullivan County historian, still is, and we tried to go to different spots. The idea was to go to a spot, give some history, show pictures of what it was. Also, I was able to interview a lot of the old hotel owners before they passed. So there's my interview with Harold Freeling, who owned the Stevensville family, Helen Kutcher, Fred Gashalter, who owned the Paramount. And I went down to Florida, and I'm still very good friends with Elaine Edis, who is, I think, 93, 94 years young. So there's interviews with everyone, and we give a little bit more history, a little bit more pictures, and it was one of my lasting pieces of when I worked at the newspaper. So it's classiccatskills.com.
And I put that in the chat for everyone. There is one more question. When did the campgrounds show up there, and are they still there?
Campgrounds.
campgrounds. Yeah. Fran Leboff. Fran asked the question. Unmute yourself.
Yep, I will.
You go. There you
What
go.
do you mean, Fran? Hi.
On myself.
Fran? She was just there. And unmute yourself, Fran.
Okay. Hi.
There you
Hi.
go.
I recall that, and I think I went camping as a kid. A lot of people, there were campgrounds up in the Catskills. People would bring their trailers, like in Ellenville and the different areas up there. And I was wondering if those were still around, or if you knew anything about them.
Well, yeah, there's the, I think it's the Yogi Bear campground in Ellenville. That's still around. That was nice. So yeah, there are state campgrounds I go to in outside of Livingston Manor in Mongop. There's a really wonderful state campground there. It's a hidden gem. So there are state campgrounds. That part of Sullivan County still is famous for its fly fishing, the Beaver Kill and the Willowy Mock. So there are still campgrounds a bit around. There is also summer camps, which will not be allowed to be open. Regular camping is allowed, but in terms of the overnight, those sleepaway camps are not allowed. Sullivan County still has Camp Chippewa and some other places like that. And some of the Jewish summer camps are not allowed. The sleepover summer camps are not allowed to open. But yeah, those places, friend, that you're talking about, they're still open.
Thank you.
Liz, any other questions?
No, I think that's it. This was wonderful.
Yeah, Barry, we'd like to really thank you again so
Thank
much.
you.
We're going to keep using you as a resource.
Thank you so much.
And
Thank you.
we know that you're the expert in the field. We just, feel so terrible that you couldn't keep that Catskills that we knew alive, but it certainly wasn't from lack of effort. I mean, you did everything possible. Marissa did a beautiful job too, trying to, show us what it's become. At the same time, other than, I think from what I've researched, maybe the Raleigh's the only hotel that's still operating as a kosher hotel, or is that gone now?
No, that's gone. Raleigh is also, that was bought up by Orthodox. Probably a good, maybe close to 10 years ago.
But I think it's maybe the only place you can still eat kosher food, because the others have all, whatever's left.
Yeah, but the Raleigh it's Orthodox.
Oh, okay, so not open to the public.
I will say this, everybody thought it was Bob Hope that you said thanks for the memories. But I say to Barry Lewis, thanks for the memories.